Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Improve Supply Chain Operations with Warehouse Automation from our corporate member KPMG. I'm Monique Fennick from Australasian Supply Chain Institute. And before I introduce KPMG, I'd like to run through some housekeeping for the webinar. Firstly, a technical check to ensure that everyone can hear me. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Great. Good to see. Thank you, everyone. If you're having any technical difficulty, please have a look in the chat section that I'm saying good morning to you now, and you can talk to the panelists directly. Two other housekeeping items. We will be running some polls throughout the webinar, which we will publish anonymous results. So please help us keep today as interactive as possible and respond to those polls. The Q&A section is not anonymous. In the panel, there are ways to see. Please use this opportunity so we can provide answers to your questions in this webinar. There will be time at the end to share responses. We will be awarding 1 CPD point to attendees from today's webinar. The webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to the ASCI Resources Library for members tomorrow. Now, our first presenter needs very little introduction to the ASCI community because Henry Brunekreef spent 2 great years as ASCI president until last year. Henry is Director, Advisory Services for Supply Chain and Operations Management for KPMG. He has 20 years of industry and consultancy expertise in leading organisations operating domestic and international experience in all aspects of supply chain, customer service, logistics, and project and change management. Over to you, please, Henry.
Thanks, Monique. Please let me know if you can't hear me. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us to the second in the series of KPMG Future of Supply Chains with specific focus on warehouse automation. Today's event is a joint event between KPMG and ASCI, of which Monique said we are a corporate sponsor. For well-known reasons, we've decided to conduct this event as a webinar, and I'm delighted to see so many people in attendance. My name is Henry Brunekreef. I'll be the host of today. And as Monique said, within KPMG, I'm a director in our operations advisory part of the business. And I lead the national practice of supply chain management. I'm personally very excited about today's event as the topic of warehouse automation is one close to my heart. It brings back memories of writing my university thesis on the justification of warehouse automation in third-party logistics contract environments. A mouthful indeed, and I can guarantee that lots has changed in the 25 years since then. Before I will introduce the great lineup and speakers of today, I would like to walk you through today's program. We'll start with Peter Liddell talking about supply chain trends derived from our latest thought leadership paper on the future of supply chains. Then it will be Chris Burns who will talk about network design and the impacts on warehousing and facilities. And last but not least, we'll have Bas Schilders from Fuzzylogx talking about trends in and decision-making across warehouse automation. We'll close out today with a panel discussion with each of the speakers. However, let's get the show on the road. Brief introductions of the individual speakers. We have Peter Liddell. Peter is the Asia Pacific lead partner for supply chain and logistics advisory. He's a senior member of KPMG's global supply chain and logistics advisory leadership executive. He leads our deliver part of the business, which is warehousing, distribution, and inventory management. In addition to his supply chain leadership responsibility, Peter is also the lead partner for life sciences in Australia. Peter has worked with clients across the Asia Pacific region for the past 30 years, where he has helped them to enhance their operational and financial performance, mainly specializing in operational strategy, supply chain, and logistics advisory. Peter is also one of the key co-authors of KPMG's latest Global Thought Leadership, Future of Supply Chains. Chris Burns. Chris has led and has been involved in creating supply chain solutions from multi-country network strategies through to 3PL tendering for over 50 organizations across 10 industry types, including some of the largest supply chains in Australia and New Zealand. Recent focus has been on online retail, airports, and industrial products, and working with clients to solve problems where there is considerable future uncertainty and where there are impacts beyond physical logistics. And last but not least, Bas Schilders. Bas is the principal consultant at Fuzzylogx, who are leading warehouse logistics and process improvement consultants in Australia, specializing in warehouse automation. His career has spanned 2 continents and 20 years in warehouse improvements and solution implementation. Bas is one of the most experienced consultants in the country when it comes to logistics improvements and implementing warehouse automation solutions. With that, I would like to hand over to Peter to take us through the latest supply chain trends.
Thank you, Henry, and just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes.
That's great. Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. So let me start getting straight into it with one of the key findings from a survey that KPMG did, a global CEO survey late last year. And the key thing that I guess CEOs shared was that transformation, continuous evolvement has become the new norm. Interestingly, only a couple of weeks ago, the global head of BCG actually shared exactly the same thought in an AFR article. But I guess if we look at this sort of statement, continuous evolution, and really it has been underpinned by the following facts that sort of resulted from the survey. So you can see here on the slide, interestingly, 96% of CEOs highlighted that they were focused on transformation. Makes you wonder what the other 4% were doing, and in fact whether or not that 4% will still be here in 12 months' time. But nonetheless, that in itself is quite a major statement. Interestingly, of those 96%, so 71% outlined that the transformation in itself was quite radical. So fundamentally changing the operating model and the ways of working going forward. Clearly, the majority, however, weren't confident that their businesses and their teams could competently build and implement the new operating model required to respond to that transformation. And the majority also shared that the technology was one of the most significant drivers underpinning transformation in their industry. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? And probably no surprise to everybody on this call, it really is very much around pivot or perish. We are at this a very true reflection point for many organizations, and we're seeing this playing out in most industries. Transform in the digital age. So that's investing in new capabilities, but it's also about rebuilding the operating model. And unfortunately, for most industries and most organizations in these industries, you either need to do that or watch competitors or new disruptors come and pass you by. And as I said, we are seeing this now play out in multiple industry sectors in Australia, across the Asia Pacific region, and certainly globally as well. Next slide, please. All right, so, but interestingly enough, not just the CEOs, the COOs have also spoken, and they have a point of view as well. So here's some of the trends, the major trends that they see shaping the supply chain function. 72%, as you can see on the slide, see as a service platforms being a major disruption to supply chain functions. And we're actually going to talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. Here's an interesting one, and again, backed up by Forrester research that we did with them about 18 months ago. 38% of organizations that are customer-centric organizations, truly achieving customer centricity, are achieving greater profitability. And actually the Forrester research was showing that those that are true customer-centric organizations are achieving 2 times at a minimum profitability. What I found really interesting coming out of this was that only 23% identified that they are very effective at generating actionable insights from customer data. You know, accessing data is easy. It's a major capability that's not well utilized. And one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is that while they're able to, many industries, many clients are able to access data, it's the lack of platforms and repositories to consolidate, bring the data together, and then allow them to analyze. Again, interestingly, 2/3 are actually looking to invest in intelligent automation to help reduce headcounts. What I found interesting was that 65% of the IT leaders in these organizations are reporting that it's a lack of skills that are actually holding back their transformation strategies. And again, going back to that previous slide where CEOs were, you know, a very high proportion, the majority were saying that it's digital technology transformation. So the fact that there are a lack of skills in organizations, and again, the need to focus on new ways of working, no surprise, will require new skills. And again, we'll discuss this a little bit on the next slide. And then finally, and again, importantly for supply chain managers, supply chain leaders, that 1/3 of companies are reporting a major uplift in cybercrime. And unfortunately, many of us are aware that a lot of the new supply chain, digital enablers, supply chain technologies that have been invested in are open platforms, and unfortunately have been a significant entry point for many hackers. So again, not discouraging, and we certainly want people to invest in these new capabilities, these new technologies, but to do that with an open mindset and understand that they need to provide the proper protection for their organisation. So with that, I might ask if we can move to the next slide, please. And before we do, it looks like we've got a quick question that we're asking everybody to answer. And while people respond to the poll, I'll continue to focus. So Henry mentioned the future of supply chain thought leadership that we put together, and today we'll just quickly highlight and share the 6 key elements that we believe will fundamentally shape and structure the performance of supply chains into the future. And again, this is backed up by obviously all of our global colleagues and all the best-in-class organisations that we are working with, but also by the major global analysts who have also participated and provided input into this insight. So the 6 key themes, I'll just work through them, and again, I'm not going to go through in detail, time doesn't permit, but just to touch on each of these. So let's start with platforms, and this is everything about this, all things as a service. And we're clearly seeing this already, that platforms are providing supply chain managers with access to advanced capabilities. And that's both, you know, accessing physical logistics, but also functional capabilities, you know, such as, you know, more advanced supply chain planning capability, etc. These platforms are really enabling also greater collaboration, I guess, between what we would say traditional and non-traditional trading partners. We're certainly seeing that. Platforms bringing data and sharing it across the extended network. So interestingly enough, you know, as a result, we're actually seeing more asset sharing practices. And we've actually had quite a lot of queries in Australia around this. So again, and I'm sure most of us heard it or had it referred to as the Uberization of transport and logistics. And these asset sharing practices are clearly being enabled by these platforms, these as a service capabilities. But what's interesting is these tactics are helping, obviously, to organizations to protect themselves against unexpected supply and demand fluctuations. And we're certainly seeing right now massive surge in demand for, you know, B2B, B2C, short-term logistics capabilities. It's also helping them, though, to shift a lot of the fixed logistics costs to becoming more variable. So again, what we're seeing, in fact, is that the entire supply chain is actually now being supported, and the ability to outsource activities, functions to platforms. The next one I'll quickly touch on is the workforce. And look, without doubt, and this is one of the biggest areas of concern from my perspective, is that whilst we're seeing accelerated levels of investment in technology, new capability, one of the biggest areas that we're seeing organisations really leave behind or have forgotten is the workforce element. as we just said, we know that organizations are investing in digital, they're automating factories, they're using more robotics, more automation, AI, sensors. We're seeing these future capabilities really play out. But what does that mean to the new ways of working? What are the types of skills? What are the types of capabilities that we need the workforce to adopt to or to change to? And what's interesting is that even a lot of our clients, a lot of organizations we speak to are saying, oh, but we're actually not yet, we're not ready to invest yet. So it's not quite relevant to our workforce. But the problem is, and this is what we keep saying, is that actually many of your customers, your suppliers, your 3PLs, your trading partners, they've actually already embraced and embarked on this journey. And so your workforce still needs to be ready and upskilled and be prepared to work with these new ways of working, how they might interact with your suppliers, with your customers, with your 3PLs. So yes, you might not be investing, but your workforce still needs to be upskilled to enable it to collaborate and work with your customers and trading partners. The third one around future-ready capabilities, I've mentioned it a lot already, rapid investment, and we're seeing it play out in many different industry sectors, in IoT, in blockchain, robotics, RPA, predictive capabilities. But again, what we're expecting and we're starting to see is that supply chain leaders will use this capability to excel in a number of areas. And I'm not going to go through them all. I'll just give a couple of examples. But again, the ability to start to get down to what we call a real micro level of demand planning. So sort of moving beyond what we see, demand being traditionally modeled at a regional or a channel, but getting right down to an outlet, right down to a customer unit at an outlet level. That's the level that these future-ready capabilities, it's a much more in-depth analytical capability than we've ever seen before. And what does that mean? The ability to model the voice of the customer at an unbelievable level. So actually now using information, and again, we're seeing global leaders doing this already, where they're starting to anticipate the customer needs before the customers are actually aware of it themselves. But what I like, again, is particularly in Australia, where we see a lot of complexity in our supply chains, is the ability to now to use this really detailed, in-depth information to get a much granular level and accuracy around the cost of complexity. Really understanding the cost of, major SKUs or major product families, how the supply chain, moves through different channels, different markets, and really get that detailed, accurate cost to serve to help them make more informed, accurate decisions in their supply chain planning processes. So again, we are seeing heavy investment, but we're seeing some great uses by leading supply chains in how to use this data and to create a competitive advantage. The fourth one around cognitive decision centers, won't say much here other than obviously it's just moving away from those traditional supply chain control towers. Really bringing in the machine learning, the cognitive, the AI capability, but actually also, one of the things that I'm sure we've all found is that the supply chain control towers are usually rear vision mirror. If anything, they're very functional siloed in the way that they analyze operational KPIs. And we are finding that the cognitive decision centers are really providing the ability to bring multiple data points in from across multiple functions across the extended value chain, and the quality and the capability of the information that's coming in, the algorithms that can then be run, and the types of decisions that are being made are at a much greater level than a supply chain control towers could ever provide. The fifth one there is around micro supply chains. And again, we've actually seen many supply chains being caught out, especially in recent times, not being flexible enough to satisfy their customers and the moving customer requirements. So the old one-size-fits-all supply chain operating model just doesn't work. And we know that supply chains traditionally have been well adjusted to focus on reducing costs. So that's led to these large integrated regional, even global networks to benefit from economies of scales. But the challenge is the variety and speed that's necessary now to satisfy customers today isn't being matched by these large integrated supply chain networks. And this is where, I guess, leading supply chain managers are now evolving and moving their operating model and shifting towards these micro supply chains, where they're much more highly flexible, they're decentralized in nature, they're able to respond and alter production and delivery, scale their volumes when they need to, and and even introduce new products at short notice. So again, one of the techniques, one of the approaches we're seeing leading supply chain managers build. And then finally, and I mentioned earlier around customer centricity, and again, the variance and uplift of performance. So we know that the customer is instrumental in customer experience and delivering and fulfilling. And especially in a world where we're made up of very commoditized products, the customer experience is ultimately the differentiator. And so those supply chains that have moved towards this capability are really seeing that 2 times performance uplift. And again, have a look at some of the disruptors we all know about: Uber, Netflix, a whole range of different e-retailers. The one thing they differentiate on is customer experience. So Henry, with that, I'm going to pause there and hand back over.
Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? So one of the things I'd like to have a chat today about is around network strategy and design, and looking at some of the factors that impact that. And then that leads really carefully and clearly into what Bas will talk about, how those networks are increasingly automated and what some of the trends are there. So network strategy and design is not something that's just used by retailers or industrial companies. It's used by a whole range of different organizations as well. And that could be international networks, so managing inbound, outbound flows. It could be internal networks as well. So it could also cover things like how to move spare parts around, a mining network in Western Australia, where the distances are very long, and where should the depots and locations and inbound DCs be sited. Some of the primary factors that companies are considering are things like sources of supply, the demand centers of gravity, so where stuff is going to and from, how to optimize inventory holding costs, so the impact of the network on the level of stock that needs to be held at each location, and what the inventory deployment strategy would be as well. The inbound, outbound freight cost aligned to the structure of the network itself. And on the next slide, we'll have a look at a couple of examples of how that can be impacted. Obviously, DC CapEx and OpEx, so the level of automation and the cost of that, and how that's tied into things like labor costs and the reducing cost of automation as well. And then growth profile too. So how does the network have to meet things like demographic needs, different products and services as well? And there's a lot of work happening with retailers and understanding how to cost those channels and how to manage them with legacy systems and legacy fulfillment capabilities. So a lot of the regional trends that we see currently are things like regionalization. Typically, for example, Melbourne has been seen in the past as being the NDC capital of Australia, but that's changing as there used to be a magic number around, if you're an importer, how many containers you would have to import before you can consider regionalization. That number's falling. So more and more importers can consider regionalization, so having networks around the country for their imports at lower levels of volumes than it used to be in the past. That's tied into things like offshore processing, automation in Australia as well, so reducing things like footprint, the alignment to online, not just for retailers, but for other companies as well, who have industrial companies who might have an online channel for their wholesalers, as well as potentially tapping into the B2C markets. We often see, or starting to see, other companies, for example, in automotive spare parts, start to understand that a lot of their processes for getting spare parts around the country is just like an online retailer as well. And so that's tied into things like WMS sophistication. So as we see the network expanding in terms of complexity and channels, and then the automation and the fit out solutions to meet that, how to make the most out of the WMS and the WCS interface, and also how, in some cases, how far behind the WMS that has existed in those organizations is, and how far it has to change to meet new fit out capabilities. Can you go to the next slide, please, Henry? So here's a couple of examples here. And the idea of these is just to show what the difference in some of the costs are, and give you a bit of an idea of how these decisions are made. So if we look at it, and this is a real example, this is for a retailer who's got an NDC. Now, by an NDC, what I mean is it's a national distribution center. So it'll be receiving product either from suppliers or inbound, and it'll be distributing around the country. In this case here, we can see the site costs are about 15%, and the freight costs are about 52%. So if we can go to the next slide, Henry. This is an RDC, so there's a regional distribution network where there is a depot or a DC or a fulfillment location that's much more closely tied into the center of gravity of demand and supply. In this case, because of the location that it's in, its site occupancy is 23%, and then the freight costs are 44%. So there's the way that this networks, and the difference between these two is around balancing the site costs with the local freight costs. We have a look at the next slide, please, Henry. So when we talk about last mile delivery, we usually talk about, and in the past, a lot of it's been around online, but increasingly the phrase last mile delivery is being used by a number of different industries because some of the issues that they face are the same. So a last mile delivery might be getting your products out to your online customers in a number of different channels, but it also might be how to deliver from a medical hospital out to a large number of hospitals from a central DC. And some of the issues are very, very similar. So those customers across those industries are looking for things like flexibility and traceability. They're looking for faster turnaround. Retailers are certainly experiencing an expectation in the UK that delivery is free, and we're starting to see that in Australia as well. If we think about online commerce and retail itself, in the UK it's 15% of sales. Australia's experience is slightly different in certain industries, but I think one of the things that we'll see out of the current COVID-19 will be a lot of the online deliveries that are happening now and the increase in that and how much that sticks in the future as well and what impact that has on the retail industry in general. So we've got a lot of new technologies that are arising. There's a lot of companies out there offering ways to Uberize freight, as Peter spoke about, new ways to manage things like track and trace with, if you like it, a non-branded fleet where you can just access into any available last mile delivery capability that's on the way. And provide live track and trace and ways of collecting customer information that maybe some of the big 3PLs have not been able to develop as fast. So there's been a lot of disruptors in that and companies that have developed capability which are around challenging the legacy freight companies in that area as well. And we've got things like, the ability to collect data through these technologies via 3PL that tells you what your customers consider and think about your delivery performance live, and even what sort of other products you're thinking of. So the next slide, please, Henry. When we think about online, there's a couple of different ways of looking at this, and we kind of see networks in three ways. If you think about a closed network, if you're the retailer, from the customer point of view, there's a whole different way and range of different channels of getting the products out to it. But from the retailer point of view, there's three main kind of network structures. There's a closed network where you might have an organization like Woolworths or Coles, which has their own network, and they have maybe a combination of different ways of fulfilling orders, like a dark store network versus a dedicated online fulfillment network. There's a shared 3PL network where you might have a number of different people and customers using the same facility, so having lots of different customers in that location. And then there's a hybrid where we have retailers that have a combination of their own fulfillment networks, and then that might be through, for example, stores. And depending on the scale of their products and the type and the segmentation, they may have DCs as well. The next slide, please, Henry. So when we do talk about last mile, we have traditionally talked about retail, as I said earlier, but these challenges really affect a lot of other industries as well. And so we need to think about, when we talk about last mile, not just retailers, but as I said before, it could be things like delivering medical products to hospitals, or it could be delivery of food out to customers, or it could be industrial spare parts, or it could be telecom spare parts. And the focus here is around how it gets from the last storage location out to the actual user. So demography is obviously having an enormous impact here. This is around driving population density, and Bas will talk a bit about how that may affect how automation is used in fulfillment locations. Obviously security, so air freight security protocols moving downstream, potentially looking at how to manage things like unattended delivery and cold chain with a more diverse network and with a more diverse way of getting products out to your customers. Autonomy, how to manage things like biometric tools so that you can manage click and collect deliveries and driverless vehicles and so on. Infrastructure, so congestion and pollution is tied into demography. Fulfillment policy, so if you think about the last mile, it's not only just getting product out to your customers, actually getting it back again. So in the UK, the level of returns is extremely high in retail. It's not so much in Australia, but that will probably change. The barriers to entry for getting somebody to deliver your stuff is very, very small. You really only need to have a person who's registered and a white van, and that's about it. There is disruptive technology coming along, so we think about this data sharing or tracking visibility or gathering information from customers at the point of delivery as well. So the convenience network, there's the growth of metro networks in Australia very rapidly over the past few years. They're really focusing on having multiple replenishments and multiple product offers essentially during the day. So they've got a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner option. So that requires potentially up to 3 different deliveries during the day, and the return logistics going out. One of the features of those 3 networks that we looked at earlier is when customers demand a change in specialization of the network, so how it moves from being in your stores to out to specialized capability. And obviously in sustainability, a lot of this is tied into your product types, but also how the products, if they're returned, how they're treated and managed safely. So the last mile, again, it's not only retail, it could be things like medical waste as well, how those get treated safely as they return out to their end destination. Thank you.
Which means I'm up, I think. Yep. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay. Because my internet connection's patchy right now. For some reason, everyone starts at 8:30 in the morning, I think. It's fine. All right. Welcome, everyone. Henry, if you can go to the first slide for me, please. Well, the second slide then, of course. I thought you'd taken this one out. Now, I hope this works because this has some animations in it as well. So maybe worthwhile, Henry, just checking. You just click one. There you go. Click the next one. Just click until all the boxes are there as well. There should be 6 of them in total. So what do we see as emerging trends in automation? Traditionally, of course, everyone sees automation as the big box, the likes of Coles, Woolies, Coca-Cola, and everyone else who implement these huge warehouses consisting of large-scale automation. What we see happening now is a trend towards what we call small and mid-sized enterprises entering into automation, who all have a lower budget, of course, and higher expectations. We always find that dealing with smaller businesses actually is a lot more, I'm not going to say difficult, but a lot more demanding than larger ones, simply because where they came from is a lot less sophisticated than the large-scale businesses. They just have a very, very good idea of where they want to go. So think of disruptors like Drake's, going up against Metcash, Coles, and Woolies, who've just automated with Dematic. We're doing a few projects now with smaller businesses who are nothing more than just a distributor of some form of a product with a couple of branches in the country, who are actually looking at automating their warehouses. And then the next trend, of course, is, we all hear about these autonomous robots. And I just came back from Modex, where there's probably 10 different types of those. And all of a sudden, locally in Australia, where we had one supplier of those a couple of years ago, the Geek Plus system that Cohesio is doing, all of a sudden now we have 5, of which 4 of them basically came up in the last year alone. So there's a lot of new technology coming to the market. There's an increased access to technology itself. And as a result, there's a lot more access to technology, which also means that for most businesses nowadays, to get automation, the threshold to get into automation is a lot less, is a lot lower, which also means that when they want to automate, it's not necessarily having to wait a year or 2 years before your system is implemented. It's actually your speed to market is a lot quicker. So there's no large infrastructure required. It's basically almost like a plug and play model. Henry, if you go to the next one for me, please. Yep, same here. Just keep clicking till everything. There should be 2 more. An arrow, that's it. So what does that mean? So traditionally, what we saw is, and what most people would see is on the left-hand side, the traditional solution approach, which is where someone would do the standard thing. You'd go to market, you'd have an RFP for a solution. A vendor would actually custom design a solution for you. It would consist of nothing more than what that vendor can offer you. So I'll compare a Dematic, for instance, to a Geek Plus, where Dematic would have a shuttle system with goods to person, with conveyors, with their own software, and it would all be their own product portfolio. So it'd basically be just Dematic's product portfolio, and that's all you can choose from. So you are relying on that system integrator for probably the next 10 to 15 years to implement a solution for you. And every time you want to change something, add something, you'd have to go back to them because it's all integrated with their software and their approach. Now, on the right-hand side is now the emerging one, is where instead of automating your entire operation, you are simply going to look at what is my biggest expense in my operation. And it can be picking, it can be packing, it can be receiving, it can be storage, it can be dispatch, and basically only automating where it's most suited. Now, what does that mean? So there are solutions in the market today which would allow you to automate just your dispatch side, where it's, for instance, just a small table or a table with autonomous mobile robots, for instance, from Tompkins. And all they do is just sort for you. And the only thing we do is you integrate it into your WMS. It only feeds it the destination required for each package that you want to sort. Someone sits at an induct station, puts the package onto a little sortation device. The sortation device drives off to the destination itself, drops it off, and basically starts driving back again. At the end of the day, when all your dispatch is finished, you basically simply pack up the table and move it somewhere else. And your floor space all of a sudden can be used for something else. Now, that means that you're not relying on a lot of steel, as we call it, a lot of hardware to be implemented. You're not tying up your floor space with just one big component that just sits idle for the rest of the day. You can actually almost plug and play components as you see fit. Now, of course, that doesn't go for everything. That was just one of the examples that we can see. But it basically comes back to automate where it makes sense. And I think one of the bigger, most important ones, as well as that number 4 and number 5, is partner independence. So you're not tied to a single vendor. If you want to get the dispatch sortation from one, you can get the picking from someone else, and you can get the storage from someone else again. And the integration then becomes almost like a black box integration where each component just handles its own specific process. The only thing you would need is an overarching WMS, for instance, to run the overall site itself. Henry, next one, please. And this is where you get the videos. So maybe just click until you see the 4 videos, and I hope they all start as well. I'm not sure you can click on all the videos for me. That's what I figured. Hope they all start. Hope they'll work. That's always a downside of running it remotely. And of course, this, does that work? I'm not sure this works online, Henry, the videos itself. Which is a shame, but it is what it is. This happened last time as well, when we did the real life version of this.
Sorry, we'll send a presentation to everyone after this.
Yeah, that's fine.
They will have the live videos in there too. Yeah.
I'll talk around the screens itself. So this is actually, oh, I can share my screen too. That's a good question, actually. Let me see if that works. If you can share me, give me the screen sharing, Henry. See if this works.
Let's just continue, Buzz, because I think we might get in
That's fine.
a lot of trouble.
Run out of time as well. So traditionally on the left, there were two videos there, one from Sigma and one actually from Toll, which are both some of the larger scale ones. So if you can imagine a huge shuttle system with goods to person compared to on the right-hand side, the bottom video is actually one from Locus, which I took 2 weeks ago at Modex, which is literally just autonomous mobile robots driving around a warehouse, transporting totes around and actually being used for picking. Whereas the one on the top right-hand side is actually a CMC machine, which nowadays is being used by Toll, by Catch of the Day, a lot of the big retailers, which is just an end-of-line carton automation machine, which you can implement standalone. So it might be worthwhile to go to the next one because this isn't going to help much, Henry. I'll just talk around everything else. So investment ROI, this comes back to the first one. Yeah, two more, that's it. So to come back to this investment ROI expectation, when you consider the ones on the left-hand side, the traditional version, if you consider the fact that you're talking about huge investments, you're talking about solutions that take a year and a half to implement before they even get up and running. The cost to do so from a capital point of view is immense. You know, you're talking CapEx investments of tens of millions of dollars itself, which are all tied up basically in steel sitting in a warehouse somewhere that's providing a return on investment, but the expectation from an ROI is between 2 to 5 years. Generally, most businesses will accept 3, which would limit the amount of solutions that would fit for automation. Whereas if we go to the emerging components, we can actually have some of these components actually are quick to install. They are actually very quick to pay back. And I think on the last slide I have in the presentation is one that I found a couple of weeks ago in Modex as well, is some of these components are actually so scalable that you can actually just wheel them into a warehouse with limited interaction and limited interfacing to an existing facility, and they can be up and running in about a week. And from an ROI expectation, we're seeing less than a year now show up for some people. And the same goes for the scaling up and down as required. This is especially now prevalent in the US. It's slowly coming in Europe as well. And we've had discussions with one of the AMI vendors locally in Australia, where instead of paying for a solution as a whole, and it's yours to own, they're actually looking at a pay-as-you-go option. So imagine, we do this the easiest. Imagine having a company car as a lease option for which you pay every month, which would be on the left-hand side. So you'd finance your solution for 3 to 5 years. And in 3 to 5 years, you'd have to pay off. You'd have a balloon payment at the end, but you still have to pay a monthly cost, which is fixed. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's like an Uber model or a GoGet. So if I need a car, I will basically pay GoGet for a car for 5 hours. And if I don't need it anymore, I basically stop paying. So the same principle applies to these solutions. Is there are vendors out there now who will actually allow you to pay as you go. So if you have a huge peak, for instance, at Christmas time, you would basically scale up to whatever peak you need and pay almost on a unit by unit basis. When your peak's finished, you basically send the units back again and you stop paying for those extra units. You only pay for the units that you need. So instead of having a payback on in 3 to 5 years, you basically just almost like a cost per unit for automation that's coming into the market now. Now, bear in mind, this is a couple of years away for Australia. This is coming up in the US now. We're hoping to see this in the next 4 to 5 years here locally as well. Henry, next slide, please. I hope this one works. Okay, this will be probably a good one. Yeah, one more, I think. That one will probably work. This is a YouTube video, basically. If you click on it, there we go. Oh, one that works. Oh, just switch off the sound for me. All right, apologies for that. That wasn't supposed to happen with sound.
Any final comments, Bas? Or
That was basically, sorry.
no, any
The thing was to talk around that. Yes. So that was basically emerging, coming into mainstream. So the company in the video was a company called Robotics. They first introduced their gripping technology about 2 years ago at Modex in Atlanta, and it's actually now in Australia as well. In the past, they would just sell a gripper to someone, and someone else would do all of the implementation. They would find the robot. They would actually program everything itself. What they now actually did is they introduced it's called Super Pick cell. It's on a skid that you can simply wheel into a warehouse and plug into your WMS, and it actually is used for returns processing. And it's a standalone cell, so it comes with its own sortation system. It comes with its own vision technology, and what it does, it allows you to put a pallet worth of stock on it, pre-barcoded if possible, and feed the data of those returns into the cell itself, and then the cell will automatically sort every single unit and identify it by the barcode and the robot and sort it to different destinations. So the cell itself is about 250,000 US, and literally it's wheeling it into a warehouse, plugging it in, feeding it data, and it runs by itself. And that's how emerging from 2 years ago is now something you can have as a product standalone in a warehouse.
Beautiful. Thanks, Bas. Just looking at the time, like to move on and get some panel Q&A going. We'll take questions, but looking at time, I'll probably start with asking the panel a few questions myself first. Peter, are you? You always get that. Peter, are you available? So, with everything that's going on at the moment, my question to you is, which of the future of supply chain capabilities do you foresee to play the most significant role in making current supply chains coronavirus resistant?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because if I look at, obviously with COVID-19, there's a number of things happening, and where right now we're seeing massive surge in demand for short-term logistics, right? So some might argue platforms, Henry, to enable to support, the sourcing of transport and logistics through this peak surge demand period. However, others that I've been talking to have been saying, well, it's actually workforce, because, we're asking people to work from home, less face-to-face contact, So there are new ways of working. And actually, we're even seeing in some sectors like healthcare and other industries, starting to replace human labour with robotics, just to remove some of that face-to-face contact. So you could argue future capability. Sorry to answer it in a long way, but I think of the 6, the majority are really important, particularly right now, helping organisations to respond to this major event.
Thanks, Pete. That makes a lot of sense. Chris, are you the next one for you?
Yep.
Which is more around based on your experience. So you've been leading over 50. I think I saw the stats in one of the last proposal. It was probably 64, but I can't be exactly precise on that. But what is, in your opinion, what are the absolute get rights for conducting the network design or product flow path optimization projects?
The key thing to understand is, what does your inbound outbound supply profile look like and your customer demand? So how do you position your location that you fulfill customer orders or destination orders? It can be different industries as well. It might be out to a depot location. The key thing is, where do you position that so that increasingly it used to be about the logistics costs, so warehouse costs, inbound outbound freight costs, but increasingly it's about the deployment of inventory as well. So what's the right place to put stock that you can fulfill your orders, but you can also reduce the amount of inventory that's being carried as well. And that's across a lot of different industries. So typically that used to be a retail answer, but now it's increasingly in things like medical products and mining parts and and all sorts of different product industries.
Thanks for that. Very good. Bas, for you, this is a question that does come up time and time again. So I'll ask it to you as the SME. Is warehouse automation for everyone, and how to make decisions to invest in automation technology? So for example, WMS versus equipment technology, like a good to person, for example.
Very good question, Henry. It's one that we have a discussion about with all our customers. So usually we find, I'll answer the first question first. Is automation for everyone? In principle, some form of automation would suit everyone, yes. What form of automation will depend on the customer itself. What we find most of the time is that there's like a fork in the road. You can either go left or you can go right. And depending on the choice you make is going to drive the automation that will be most fit for you. And with that fork is, when you haven't improved your operation a lot, so you're sort of at the beginning of your improvement process, there's 2 ways you can go. You can either fully automate, which would be like a big bang approach where you take a leap in efficiency, which would have a great reduction in either staffing, you have a great efficiency gain, cost reduction, which means usually a bigger budget for automation, which would benefit longer term. However, if you were to take the fork to the left and say, let's work on process improvements first, improve a WMS or implement a WMS, start looking at just simple process improvements, you'd already take a huge chunk of that benefit away, and you'd be left with a more efficient operation, which would then limit the automation options available to you at that point. And it depends on where a customer is in their process or in their operation, whether large scale automation or a lot of automation makes sense or less automation makes sense.
Fair enough. That's a good consulting answer, Bas. It depends.
Well, in the end,
I'm kidding.
The thing that we find is a lot of customers that we encounter, the biggest enemy we have nowadays is sites like YouTube and Vimeo and LinkedIn, where everyone looks at the nice and shiny things, and then they come to us and saying, oh, we want something like this. And then you start doing the business case and it just doesn't stack up.
No.
So we always take a bottom-up approach. You only automate where it makes sense. If you don't have to automate, don't automate.
Fair enough. No, that's good. Thanks, Bas. Pete, just to go back to you, you're across many sectors in your lead role across Asia Pac. in your eyes, what are some of the sectors and industries that are at the forefront of digital transformation from a supply chain perspective, and which ones are lagging? And for the latter, why are they lagging?
Okay, so I think most are starting to get into the act, Henry. Unfortunately, Australia seems to be a good 12, 18 months behind ASPAC and the rest of the world, right? So I'll say this with an ASPAC global sort of viewpoint. So I think agribusiness, retail, life sciences, healthcare were early out of the box. Agribusiness adopting IoT from a farm level, even blockchain all the way through. Similar with life sciences, blockchain capability, retail tapping into POS, loyalty, and using a lot of that predictive analytics. So I think, and I use retail both the online and offline capability. So I saw them, a couple of years ago as real early adopters getting in there. But we're finally starting to see, I think, the rest of the industries catch up. And most surprisingly, I'm surprised they weren't early adopters, but they're certainly getting into it now and accelerating their investment is, the transport and logistics industry, really starting to, I guess, invest in those proven technologies, especially with, the advanced track and trace capabilities that we've received, emerging into the global marketplace. So there were some early adopters, but I'm happy to say that the other sectors are finally starting to get their act together.
Beautiful. Thanks, Pete. Chris, as far as you're concerned, because we just only have to look at the current environment, but the global regional business landscape becoming increasingly more uncertain and definitely more complex. How do you consider this in your network and in your network design? And is advanced warehouse automation therefore an opportunity or potentially an additional threat?
I think there's really two aspects impacting that. One is international freight if you're an importer. So traditionally, probably until the past few weeks, this answer was really easy. But we've seen over the past few days the cost of things like air freight increased by a factor of 6 or 7 times. So it's really hard to see from the international freight point of view what will happen after COVID-19 settles down. Not only just from an air cargo point of view, but shipping point of view as well. There's potential restrictions on cargo ships entering ports that are being discussed and so on. So the answer used to be that the key factors and changes were around how to balance up the international freight and your domestic network consequently. I think that what we might see in the future is it's a bit of a tough one. We might see regionalization will continue, and we'll see a more offshoring, certain things like value-adding services as other countries like Malaysia and Singapore and so on, and Singapore continues its sophistication, becomes more expensive. The question is, I'm not sure what's going to happen out of China, and one of the other questions was, do we see more onshoring of production? And I think that in the future, in certain industries, that will rise, and that will change a lot of the network decisions. But I think that's going to be quite industry specific. Does that answer your question?
I think you did, Chris. Thanks very much. Just going now to the Q&A page. Some of the questions to you, Chris. Do you foresee more cost increases in terminal and also more blank sailings from China specifically?
Again, if we think about the past couple of weeks, a lot of the questions around things like air cargo and sea cargo being different. Air cargo, the price has risen astronomically, but there's still questions about whether what capability and capacity will exist in air cargo in the future without government support. And sea freight, well, if we think about sea freight to Australia, and we ignore sea freight to the US and the trade war there, typically sea freight to Australia was full containers in and about 30% empty containers out. So if we talk about blank sailings from China specifically, I think that can only be driven by the economic situation in Australia and the demand for that. But we need to remember that Australia's a bit unique in that respect, and that it is large. Well, there's a tendency towards import full containers, sometimes 20 footers, export refrigerated and largely 40 footers out. So, and about 30% of those are empty. So blank sailings from China, no, I don't know if we can answer that until we see how COVID-19 really settles down.
Thanks, Chris. Just answering the remainder of the Q&A, and I think then we'll wrap it up for the day. One of the key questions is coming from Avinesh, and Pete, I'd like to pass that on to you. How does one deal with, I think it was bad data? How does one deal with the challenge of bad data if you're trying to base things like predictive analytics on that?
Good question. And with all the predictive analytics been doing over the last couple of years, it's the it's always there, so it's front of mind. So two things. So one is internally, a lot of our clients have bad data. Well, actually, pretty much everyone has a range of bad data, and there's enough tools and capabilities now to help sort of filter that and sort through it. So that's from the internal perspective. But using big data to predict, absolutely. And this is why a lot of the really strong, capable predictive tools take time to get going, because the AI and machine learning that's in it takes time to filter through and learn over time and distill between, I guess, quality and poor quality data, especially if you're tapping into, Henry, things like social media, news outlets, those sorts of things. We all know there's a lot of fake news, a lot of rubbish, a lot of personal views in there. But again, through a period of 3 to 6 months, we do see these tools starting to sharpen up quite significantly. They are very impressive with the way they're able to filter quality and poor quality data. So it is an issue. It's something that needs to be built into the time frame that you bring these on board and really start to use them to full effect. But certainly we've seen leaders who adopted them quite some time ago work through it.
Thanks, Pete. The one before last question, and I think I'll address that to Bas, but Chris, don't be shy to jump in as well. The question is, one of the key benefits drivers for automation projects is to reduce labor costs. If Australia now experiences an unexpected sharp rise in unemployment out of COVID-19, do you expect that to impact the ROI calculation enough to slow the push towards automation, or are the other drivers still going to outweigh this and be more significant?
Good question. I mean, the huge rise in unemployment right now, unfortunately, or fortunately, is not in our industry. So if you watched the news yesterday, Coles, Woolies, all the retailers are scrambling for more staff to keep up with demand. The unemployment right now is in hospitality, retail, all the businesses which have been forced to close due to the coronavirus at the moment. And most of those people have no intention of working in a warehouse environment in the first place. Plus, I mean, unless government steps in and starts reducing the wages that we have at the moment in a warehouse environment through enterprise agreements and everything else, and the costs to operate come down, see a change in that. If anything, it's proven that a reliance on staff is actually going to be less beneficial than we had in the past. So this is where automation would really shine. It runs 24/7. So it's not really, it's relying on staff to keep it running, but it's not relying on a huge amount of staff. So in future, when not even an if, the changes in supply chain, as mentioned by Peter and Chris before, to make it more resilient, I think we'll get a lot more stock back into the country again, and hopefully more manufacturing back again, which would mean an increase in warehousing and distribution in general, which as a result would mean that a lot more businesses will be looking at being more efficient than what they are today.
Beautiful. Thanks, Bas. And I think to everybody that's been asking questions, I think what we will do is we will actually take these questions, and when we send out the paper and the presentation, we'll come back on that as well. Last question. It's a very interesting question. I think I'll give that to Chris, and Pete, you can weigh in as well. But do you think that the emergence of COVID-19 will drive R&D and government acceptance on drone delivery in the coming years via autonomous air-ground vehicles?
It depends where it's coming from. So if we're thinking about, we had this question actually, we were working on a project in an airport, and one of the questions was, are we going to see drone deliveries from airports? Because we've got an increase of international online freight, so small packages coming into airports, the growth and volume is enormous. So would you see it in an airport? No, the reason for that is because it has to match the regulatory requirements of that inbound location. So we might see more drones from another location. So if you think about inbound into a depot, then out to say a sorting depot, and then possibly drones there. We get asked the question about drones and automation and vehicles all the time, and it's been talked about a lot. And I don't think any of our customers are seriously talking or thinking about it for a long time, from a network design or a final delivery point of view.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Chris, that's supplemented by the fact that there's still way too many regulatory hurdles when you start thinking about airspace, transport regulations, security, biosecurity. There are so many things that need to be ticked off at a state and federal government level that haven't even been started yet, Henry. So yeah, assuming they were all ticked through, you're probably going to start the conversations at a client level. But yeah, I haven't seen anyone seriously thinking about it yet because of all the regulatory hurdles that need to be cleared.
Very good. Well, and then one final question. It's from a gentleman that very well known within KPMG. So Pete, as his direct manager, maybe I'll ask you to answer that question. Can you direct me to who to look to as leaders in cognitive decision center development?
Well, at the moment, there's a lot of business cases to move from supply chain control towers, and actually, probably one of the best ones that I've seen in Australia is Telstra with their national security centre that they operate, obviously in a location in Victoria, which I can't state because it's quite secretive. But they'd be one of the leaders that I've seen with their ability to bring multiple decision analytics into one place and drive a lot of algorithms. So they'd be a standout. There's a couple in Europe that are building capability but haven't launched it yet.
And I think just to add on top of that, I think Schneider Electric actually is one that is probably recognized in that field as well. And interestingly enough, coming many years ago from a very low maturity, we now see companies operating in the energy, natural resources, especially in mining, that they are at the forefront of the enterprise-wide cognitive decision centers. All right. With that, what I would like to do is to wrap up today's session. I think today we've heard about the second of KPMG's Future of Supply Chain series, focus on warehouse automation. Normally, I would like to ask for a little applause, but in this new world of webinars, I would like for everyone to raise their hand electronically to thank our speakers. So Pete Liddell, Chris Burns, and Buzz, thank you very much for your efforts and for your insights. And also, what I would like to do is there's always people behind the scenes that make us look good and make our lives easier. So also for our marketing manager, Jenny Lamb, great job. Thanks, Jenny. And also if you could raise your electronic hand to thank her. So with that said, I would like to thank everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will be back with future webinars on equally interesting topics. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining today. Type CPD into the Q&A if you would like to redeem your CPD points. Inquiries about membership are at inquiries@asci.org.au. And please remember there's going to be a webinar every week that ASCI provides during COVID-19 to keep us all connected. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thanks, Monique.